In this portion of our Worldviews and Values class, we're now going to turn to one of the major works by an 18th century philosopher, Mary Wollstonecraft. It's written around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, so it's occupying a very important place. It's also considered to be one of the major, you might say even founding works in feminist thought, but it goes beyond that. It has analyses of some great intellectual power that have to do with our understanding of virtue, our understanding of society, of the relations between men and women. As usual with this class, what we're going to do in this first part is talk about the literary genre of this work. We'll talk about the historical context, which is quite important, and then we'll talk about some of the key themes. This video is intended primarily just to help you get ready to move into the work. So what do we want to keep in mind with respect to the literary genre of this work as we're first approaching it? So it's called a vindication. And when you see that term vindication, you should think polemics or controversy. There's already some topics in play that people have staked out a position on, and in order for there to be a vindication, there has to be somebody, presenting some resistance. And so this is actually the second of Wollstonecraft's vindications. She wrote an earlier one in 1790 called The Vindication of the Rights of Man. This one is the 1792 work called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. There's a kind of parallelism there, but the later work is considered to be much more important, and it's much more general in its purview, you can say. Now, what would the vindication actually be about? What's the context in which it's written? If you look at the dedication, she dedicates it to this guy, Talleyrand, and Talleyrand had written a report to the French National Assembly. And in his report, he was talking about education in general, and he had a part in there where he's saying, women should only get a domestic education. Men should have a public education. Women should have an education provided at home. That's what a domestic education means. So Wollstonecraft is actually responding to this report by writing something to say, no, you've got it all wrong. Here's why the position that you're taking is actually wrong-headed and misguided. She's broadening the topics away from just that one particular report to the issue of women's place in society in general and the progress of humankind, what that's going to take. So what she's going to do as she's writing this is give you a set of essays. Each chapter is its own, you might say, self-contained essay, and she's coming back to the same basic ideas, looking at them from multiple perspectives. So, there's a little bit of repetition involved there, but she's actually such a good stylist that you probably don't notice too much of that. She's great at blending several different styles together. You're going to notice also that she's engaging several other authors very often by name. Some of them are not quite so important, like this Dr. Gregory. One of them is of particular importance, that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had been very influential on the French thought that's going on at the time of the French Revolution. So she's addressing Rousseau very directly in this. And unless you know a lot about Rousseau's philosophy, or at least some of the broad outlines, some of the things that he's saying might not make complete sense until you get those puzzle pieces. So when you're reading this work, what you want to be doing is looking for the argument that's being developed. She's doing it, though, in multiple ways, so you have to do a bit of reconstruction, and she's moving from topic to topic to topic because they're all interrelated with each other. If you had to say that there's one central, single point around which the entire vindication is constellated or moves around or is, arranged, it would probably be that unless women are afforded a sort of equality of treatment in education that will allow them to develop virtues, to develop their minds, to become independent, we will never have a good society. Let's talk now about the historical context of this work. And it's a very exciting story that we've got to tell, not only about the big picture, the panorama of what's going on in Europe at the time, but also about the life of this woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, as a writer, as sort of a representative of the very education and focus on virtue that she's writing about in her work. So the historical context, if you wanted to really boil it down to a kind of slogan, you could say that she's writing in a time when the Age of Enlightenment is turning into the Age of Revolution. What do we mean by that? So the Age of Enlightenment was the 18th century, and insofar as the 18th century was about the development of sort of public opinion and power structures, social structures outside of the clergy, outside of the nobility, the rise of the bourgeoisie to gain more and more and more authority, power, not only politically, but socially, intellectually. The criticism of existing institutions as being unreasonable, as being arbitrary, as breeding and perpetuating superstition and exploitation of human being by human being. That was what the Enlightenment was about. And part of the promise of the Enlightenment was if we could just like sweep away all this old stuff, all this detritus, then we could have a rational society in which people don't have to exploit each other, in which everybody can develop the way that they ought to be, in which human nature would truly be realized instead of being stunted and held back. Now, why does that shift into an age of revolution? Because people who have power don't like to let go of that power, and people who want to see major changes take place sometimes have to push and radicalize their efforts so that they overthrow the present state of society and begin again. And that's what a revolution really is. It's a drastic change where you move from this position to that position. It goes beyond just reforming, changing little bits and pieces. You're saying, we got to start all over again. And that's indeed what they were doing. The French Revolution was more radical than the American Revolution, and the American Revolution was pretty radical, throwing off the British king, starting a republic, having a constitution, having a Declaration of Independence. All these sorts of things had their fruit in the French Revolution, which comes after that. And in the French Revolution, they kill the king, they kill a lot of nobility, they nationalize a lot of institutions that were in the hands of the nobles or the church. It becomes very, very dramatic what's going on. And there's a lot of debate, as there always is when there's a revolution, about, well, where should we go from here? What kind of new society are we trying to build? Now, along with that goes a discussion about the rectification of inequalities. How should we change the new social system apart from the old so that we can create new opportunities, so that we can equalize things, so that we can get rid of these hereditary class distinctions, or distribute wealth more fairly, or make it possible for people who are excluded from certain institutions to get into them. And whenever you do that, you end up opening the door to somebody who you weren't planning on saying something, also raising their hand and saying, hey, what about us? And Wollstonecraft is not the only woman at the time to do that. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of other women who are saying, you're right, this human rights, the rights of of man to property, to happiness, that's great. How about for us too? Can we have some of this great new revolutionary society? And that tended to make quite a few of the men, who were the ones who were actually doing the political work in the revolution, the ones who were voting in the National Assembly, the ones who were making the speeches, that tended to make a lot of them very uncomfortable because they were used to having something that they could rely upon, you might say, permanent underclass of women. And somebody like, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had, even though he was for the rights of man and the rights of humanity in the abstract, he actually said that women basically exist to make men happy and they should be educated for that purpose. So there's a lot going on here, a lot of ferment. So there's also, you can say, I've already talked about the fact that the public sphere has become very important by now. So we're thinking about books, we're thinking about articles, we're thinking about essays, we're thinking about pamphlets even, as ways in which people are not just spreading information, but appealing to the educated class, which now includes quite a lot of the people who are making decisions, appealing to them and saying, this is the way that we should think about things. And those other guys over there, they're dead wrong. Wollstonecraft is wading right into this. She has met some of the other movers and shakers of that time, like Edmund Burke, like Thomas Paine, the people who are writing these popular tracts that are trying to make a case about how society ought to be ordered, what human life ought to be like. And there's a lot of things going on. The Republic of Letters has now become something a little bit less genteel and a little bit more like a debating floor. So she is taking part in that. And this is probably a good place to talk about her biography a little bit. So Mary Wollstonecraft, in many respects, exemplifies the kind of influence of education that she is advocating for men and for women. She also exemplifies to a certain extent the orientation towards marriage, towards love, towards virtue that she is holding to be central. She's also exemplifying certain what we might call bourgeois attitudes or values, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So she lives a rather unconventional life in many respects. Some of this only comes to light later on when her widower, William Godwin, publishes a work after her death called Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication, Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Women, where he sort of reveals everything. That actually ends up doing some harm to her reputation once it comes out and prevents some people from reading her for a while. But she is, in many respects, a self-educated person. She learns through reading voraciously whatever she's able to come across. She ends up deciding, at a time when very few people could make it as authors and almost no women had tried to do this, she decides that she's going to make a living as an author after trying a number of other different occupations that were a bit more traditional, being a lady companion, being a governess. She decides, no, I'm gonna become an author, and she learns more and more and more by doing so. When she's talking about the importance of our professions in our continuing education, she's an example of that because she was able to just sort of suck in literature from every corner of the globe. She translated articles from French and German, articles in books. So she was really at the heart of what was going on intellectually in that century. And she did so through hard work, through cultivating virtue, through, pressing ahead, through not being the sort of, wallflower who shrinks back, but being somebody who is quite assertive. As a matter of fact, William Godwin, she kind of turned him off at first when she met him. There's this great story that's told about her where the very first night that they met, William Godwin was kind of a rebel type and pretty radical himself. And so he's meeting this very intelligent, vivacious woman. And what does she do? She argues with him all night long, the entire night. But that was the kind of person that she was. And it fits her mentality, because she thought that that's the sort of thing that you would actually have to do in order to merit equal respect. You'd have to show that you have a mind. You have to show that you can cultivate male virtues, that they're not really male virtues at all, that they're just virtues, and that they belong to everybody. She does express a rather bourgeois point of view, which makes perfect sense for the time, because she is part of that social class. You can say that it's essentially a middle class way of looking at things, where the rich, even though they have a better social position, they really are not morally better off, and oftentimes they're worse off. The poor are not really to be emulated, but you want to help them pull themselves out of their situation by hard work, by the cultivation of virtue, by the improvement of their minds. She stresses self-improvement, industry, education, and independence. And these are all sort of typical rising bourgeois values. The 18th century and a good part of the 19th century are really the time in which that social class is the most dynamic, are the ones that are leading the culture. So she's right at the center of that. It's probably important to talk a little bit about, when we're looking at this history, about the history after she dies. She dies in 1797. She's only 43 years old when she dies. And her work is quite successful, especially the Vindication of the Rights of Women. For the first, say, 30, 40, 50 years, it's translated into French. It's released in American editions. She influences a lot of women writers. There's quite a few men who are reading her as well. She's writing stuff that's of the first caliber when it comes to social theory and ethics. And then, because William Godwin publishes his memoirs about her, it's going to erode her reputation, in part because this is something that I didn't mention in the biography section. She did live an unconventional life in many other respects. She had a child out of wedlock. It was a product of a love affair with this American adventurer who kind of throws her over. There's actually love letters that she wrote to him that are extremely interesting and are sort of exemplifying some of the things that she's talking about in this work when it comes to love, passion, marriage, desire, virtue, all these sorts of things that fit in. She also had some rather unconventional affairs with other people. She had a few suicide attempts. And so all of these sorts of things, when they came out, they're coming out in a time when reputation and sort of being the right kind of person was considered very important for authors. And so a lot of people will then say, well, we're not going to read this stuff because she's clearly no good. Well, it's too bad, because they deprived themselves of a great experience of reading a wonderful classic work that will probably be read thousands of years from now. Later on, as feminism becomes a real going concern in the 20th century, there is a revival of attention to her work. And people start to understand the real importance of it. And she's now today considered one of the most important early feminists. In some respects, I think that's a bit too narrow, because what she's advocating is not just virtue for women or equality for women. She's actually making an argument, a very interesting argument, about the need for both women and men to cultivate the same kind of virtue so that they can actually have a relationship which is one of equality. That provides us with a good lead-in for talking about what some of the key themes are. So, we just mentioned equality. So, equality versus inequality. This is one of the key themes that she's trying to work out there. She's thinking not only about the existence of both of those, but what creates them and what perpetuates them, particularly in relation to women and how they are maintained in a position of inequality, even in societies that seem to be moving towards more and more equality. She also talks quite a bit about the nature of civilization. And in her view, we're not yet fully civilized. We won't be entirely civilized. Civilization will be held back until both men and women develop their intellectual faculties, develop their virtues, and exist in a station of equality with each other, in which they can actually have mutual respect and relationships that are not exploitative. Until we have that, she thinks that we're always going to be in a state of semi-barbarism. We may think that we're civilized, but we're actually still living out a kind of, primitive lifestyle that has managed to bring itself forward, from century to century to century, and consolidate itself in distinctions of class, distinctions of power, distinctions of wealth, all these sorts of things. Another key theme that you're going to see her talk about an awful lot is this notion of virtue. So a virtue is a good character trait, and she thinks that these are what actually human nature is supposed to be about, that we're only realizing our human nature when we cultivate the virtues. Two virtues that she talks about in particular that I think I should single out here are virtues that are often talked about as feminine or womanly virtues, and she wants to say that if we understand them in their proper sense, they're for both men and women, and whatever is just for women in them isn't really a virtue. So she talks about gentleness, and she talks about modesty. Another key theme that she's coming back to over and over again is intellectual development. We have the capacity as human beings to develop our intellect, to develop our imagination, to use our faculty of reason, and to eventually expand our mind, to make it better and better and better. Oftentimes we don't do that, she believes, and unfortunately the kind of education that women are getting tends to do it less than for men. This is a good point to talk about another key theme, which is education. Wollstonecraft thinks that education takes place outside of the schoolroom, in society, in our culture, in the family, in the workplace, in our professions, in the ways in which our ideas are associated, the ways we live out our lifestyle, the lessons and conclusions that we draw from them. That's all education. And education can be done well or it can be done very poorly. She thinks that most women are actually miseducated in the society that she's writing to. Another key idea is that of independence. An education is supposed to make us independent, and independence is one of the key components in a full human life. As a matter of fact, she thinks that we can't entirely cultivate the virtues unless we do so from a position where we get to decide for ourselves, where we're not just subject to another person. And so, the opposite of independence would be dependency. And she's very much concerned with the ways in which women are kept in conditions of dependency, the ways in which they're educated towards dependency. Another key idea that she talks about that's related to this is the emphasis on beauty and pleasing men as what is most important for women. So in place of, real virtues, in place of intellectual development, women are steered towards what she calls bodily accomplishments, which are often detrimental to their health, detrimental to their development as human beings, and which don't actually get them what they would want from their mates or spouses anyway, which is respect and a genuine kind of love. She also does talk, and this is another key theme, about how we ought to understand the passion of love. And by that she means, everything from straight out sexual desire to our, sort of romantic infatuation feelings, and everything in between. She tends to downplay this. She thinks that it's not that important in relationships. And that leads us to our last key theme of this, which is that she thinks that the proper relationship between men and women, if women aren't just going to be independent, is in a marriage that is based on mutual respect for the other person as an intellectual equal, as somebody who's displaying virtue that you can share in, and which develops into a kind of intimacy and friendship. So those are the key themes, things that you should keep a particular eye out for as you go through this great work.